So good morning, everybody. I'm just going to leave it for a couple of seconds because I see people are beginning to flood into the event, but let's give it a couple of seconds before we start. Okay. Let's get underway. So good morning and a very warm welcome on behalf of FIPRA and the Institute for Ethics in AI, based at the Munich Technical University, TUM, to this online conversation on data and ethics in AI. How will the German EU presidency shape prospects? My name is Jacki Davis. I have the privilege of moderating our totally interactive discussion over the next hour. We're going to start with some questions from me to our distinguished panel, and then I'll be coming out to all of you. Housekeeping on how to join in. You probably all know this after so many months living in the virtual world, but on this platform, just to remind you, you are all muted for now. If you want to write a question, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, not the chat button, the Q&A button, please, and write your question. And may I ask you, please, could you be brief so that I can see at a glance what your question is and who it's for? Could I suggest Twitter length or less would be wonderful. If you want to speak, click on the raise hand button and I will, when the time comes, unmute you, tell you I've done it. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to put your camera on. So if you're watching us in your gym jams, that's absolutely fine. We're not going to know. One last thing. There is a chat box as well. If you have any technical issues, you can't see us, you can't hear us, you need a little bit of help, we have some wizards behind the scenes who are there to try to help you with those. So use the chat button for that, the Q&A button, please, for any questions to our panel. So let us turn to our topic. And what we're going to talk about today is, we all know how much potential artificial intelligence has to be a driver of economic development, to provide solutions to societal challenges. But it also poses challenges, and the more we rely on it to help us take decisions, the more important the ethical implications become. And the debate on those implications couldn't be more important or timely, coming as it does on the day the European Parliament is voting on its vision for the future of AI, ahead of the European Commission's proposals due to be unveiled early next year, and in the middle of Germany's EU presidency, with its focus on digitalisation and the use of technologies like artificial intelligence as a key to economic recovery in Europe. So, great day to be having this discussion, and let me introduce our speakers. Joining us from one of Germany's leading universities on AI, I've mentioned them already, the Technical University of Munich, TUM, Professor Dr. Christoph Lutge, Director of the TUM Institute for Ethics in Artificial Intelligence. Very warm welcome, Christoph. Kilian Gross, Head of Technologies and Systems for Digitizing Industry Unit in the Directorate General for Communication Networks, Content and Technology, better known to all of us in Brussels as DG Connect, in the European Commission. Elizabeth Crossick, Head of Government Affairs EU in the RELEX Group, a global provider of information-based analytics and decision tools, and Robert Madelin, Chairman of FIPRA International and a member with Christoph of the AI for People Scientific Committee. Very warm welcome to you all. As I said earlier, totally interactive conversation. Let's jump straight in. In the European Parliament debate yesterday, Alex Voss MEP said, and I quote, "AI systems must be a tool for humans, mastered by humans, at the service of humans." Let me ask you, and Christoph, if I could turn to you first, what for you are the most important ethical questions we need to address? If we are to get this balance that your committee have pointed to, every time you look at an opportunity, there's a risk. How do we get that balance right? What are the most important issues we need to tackle? Same question to you all.
Yeah. There are a number of ethical questions which are important. What is, for me, the most pressing one is one that is particular to AI, and that has not yet come up in earlier ethical discussions, and that is the question of explainability, actually. Because to many people, what they fear about AI is this kind of black box character. They don't know what the systems do. They don't know what AI does, and I think a lot of the mistrust comes from that. So I think having more in terms of explicability, whatever that means in detail, is at least one of the most pressing issues. issues. And I think I would like to mention a second one, which is not part of the principles, but which is the relation between ethics and regulation. Because we will see ethics of AI, we will also see regulation or governance, let's say governance in more general terms of AI. And to find a great balance between these two, I think that will be a key task.
Thank you very much indeed. Kilian, in those broad terms, would you agree? This debate has been going on for some time. Principles and guidelines have been developed by the scientific committee, by the high-level group. What do you think is the most important issues we need to be talking about now?
I think what Professor Lutge mentioned is exactly the right point, because AI is distinct from other technologies because it has certain features that you, as an operator, do not always know whether a certain input will lead to a specific output, because there is in between the way the system functions is not obvious. Because it's self-learning, it uses a lot of data. The data is sometimes infinite, so you cannot really reconstruct how the data has been used and how the data has been processed. So you have this effect that you have, you put something into the system and you get something out of the system, and this in between is not completely transparent. And this is exactly why AI is, why it's very characteristic, different than other technologies, and that why we need perhaps specific rules in order to look at how can we make sure that people understand what's going on? How can we make sure that it's documented? So if something goes wrong at the output, that you can find out who did the mistake, why did the mistake happen? Was it the input data? Was it the design of the system, the algorithm? Was it the handling of the system? That we have a human oversight, that we make sure that the machine does not take decisions on humans. That's a question on human dignity. That we have as well there, that we have as well robustness and accuracy, so that we know what the data are about, because the AI is as good as the data it uses. So we need to make sure that the data used for the AI is unbiased, is balanced, is fit for the context, takes the context related elements into account. So these elements are very specific to AI. And the more AI gets into our society and our economic and social life, the more important is it to get these things right.
Absolutely. And added to that, Elizabeth, I mentioned the German presidency and this context that we're talking about of digitalization as a key to the recovery. For you, what are the most important issues, and how important do you believe, as a company working in this area, getting the answers to this right? How important is that going to be if digitalization generally, AI specifically, is to play the role that is being envisaged for it, both in greening the economy and in moving us forward?
Good morning, and well, I don't want to necessarily disagree with my esteemed colleagues here, but I would challenge just a little bit. First of all, I think it's quite interesting that if you think about the human brain, do we know how we make our decisions in the first place? I mean, a lot, I think the answer is no. We think we do. We think we make our decisions with our head, but actually we don't necessarily make our decisions with our brain. There are other factors that help to make us take decisions, which are not always as rational as we like to think they are. And for me, AI, really, if you unpick it, it's a set of technologies. It's a method to help solve a business case, a use case, a problem. And I think the more we talk about this mysterious, new, difficult application, the more people start to worry about the risks rather than see the value that AI brings. And I think, actually, all of this, why does this worry us? Because we need people to be brought along with it, right? We can't use technologies, we can't use systems if the citizen is afraid. And we've seen lots of examples over the years where we've not actually brought the communication and the explanation to people along the same time as the product or whatever it is that we're bringing out, and then it's failed. So I do think there is a narrative we kind of need to be careful about, which is, of course, there are risks. Inherent in human life is a risk. If you didn't want to take risks, you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning, right? There are risks. We need to look at how we mitigate and ameliorate those risks, absolutely. But we need to talk about the benefits, right? And I think context in this case is really important. So in the kinds of work that we do in my company, we help people make decisions. And I say that very, very carefully. We help people make decisions. Machine doesn't take a decision. It enables, it's, if you like, augmented intelligence. It helps people to make decisions based on more accurate and better information and better data. And there we talk about, obviously we talk about ethics, but I would like to talk about quality as well. Because I actually think the quality of the data encompasses all of that, and that's really what we're talking about here.
And hence this dual title for our event today. But Robert, turning to you, to what degree do you think that the ethical challenges that AI poses are, Elizabeth suggesting they're not as fundamentally different as maybe is being implied, is being inferred. The challenges the public, and Christoph talked at the beginning about explainability and so on. How different do you think are the ethical challenges posed in this area?
If I start with the answer to your first question, if explicability and positive benefits are the key success factors for AI deployment, that is the same as all the science shows for public opinion on any technological innovation. So in that sense, the public always wants to know, how does it work and what's in it for me? And therefore AI is a particularly salient instance of the overall problem. How does Europe grasp and embrace technological innovation? Secondly, I very much agree with Elizabeth's point. Listening to your MEP quote, there's an underlying assumption that human institutions are omniscient and omnipotent, that normally we know what's going to happen and we can control what's going to happen. And actually there are always unintended consequences and the crooked timber of humanity. So there I would say AI is not unique in the risk. Where I think it could become unique in the risk is if you set up a machine that you deliberately lose control of and you give it the wrong instruction, it could take over the world. But that's a very extreme scenario. And then the third thing I'd say is you have to go sector by sector. I think the context is very important. And let me throw out a commercial message on behalf of the AI for People Consortium. If you're interested in the sectoral approach, whether it's media, banking, insurance, cars, there's a 2-day session, 1st, 2nd of December, where we're going to be unpacking the work that the AI for People Consortium is contributing on that. But final point, therefore, in this messy world, I think this is a huge opportunity, this is Kilian's piece, for innovative regulation. And I think we've already seen out of the DG Connect end of the Commission some quite innovative approaches where you set the principles, you monitor, you frame, and you have powers to come back with, in a way, tertiary legislation. The tragedy of innovative regulation in Europe is that the Commission doesn't have enough power to take swift tertiary action, subordinate legislation where there's a new problem. But we absolutely have to avoid the sort of clunky approach. So a sectoral approach and an innovative approach will enable us to maximize the success factors for AI.
Okay, well, to come back on what that innovative but not clunky approach would look like in a moment. But Kilian, just to the broad issue and linking this back to the German presidency and the question of how important it is that we get this right. Because I was quite struck, RELX, I know, did a survey of business people on their use of AI during the pandemic, and saw 2/3 had increased their investment in it, and 86% of them said ethical considerations are a strategic policy, strategic consideration when they're designing and implementing their AI strategies, and because not just because of the societal good and the do no harm, but also as a business consideration. It gives you can give you competitive advantage. How important do you think it is to make rapid progress now in answering the questions we're going to be discussing, if it's to play that role? And then we'll move more into some of the detail. But Kilian, broadly, how important is this?
I think it's quite instrumental. I mean, I really agree as well with what Elizabeth said, that there is enormous potential of AI, and we should not now put a general suspicion. I mean, that's certainly not our objective now to create this idea or suspicion AI is very dangerous and better don't touch it. it's a country. I think what we want to do, and we see that as well from studies, is that as well on the business side, there's a feeling of legal uncertainty, there's a feeling of risk for liability, and of course of public acceptance. And we know from other technologies, Robert has pointed that out, if technologies are not socially accepted, they are not really rolled out. Be it justified or not, it doesn't really matter. It's the main thing is, if the public is afraid or scared, you will not really achieve social acceptance. And therefore, I think what we need is not regulation at all price or regulation in all detail, but we need regulation which creates trust. So I think intelligent regulation, which is risk-based, so which really looks where do we really need to intervene, where it's really needed that we set standards and requirements, but really reduce to clear-cut cases where we identify an individual problem. And by doing so, giving a general guarantee that the AI systems which are brought to the market or used in Europe are trustworthy. That can, I think, square a little bit the circle, because it can push the uptake and the commercialization of the technology, and at the same time, it can give a reply to these ethical questions. I don't think that there is a discrepancy or a tension between ethical requirements here and business requirements. I think that the study you quoted, there are others where we see the same. The TÜV has done a study. We had done several studies where as well business side was calling for a clear framework. They don't want a heavy regulation, but they want clarity and certainty. And that's, I think, what we could and should provide for all players on that market. And then I hope the market will flourish. And according to our estimates, the investments can even quintuple in 5 years. So there is a lot of potential, and Europe needs this potential, because we are in investments still behind the US and China, and we clearly have a strategy of boosting our investments. We want to have 20 billion euros investment every year in AI, but we need a good framework for this.
Thank you. And I'm not going to try and get you to reveal what will be in the Commission proposal. We're some months from it, but I will come back. I'd like to know a little bit more about how you see getting that intelligent regulation, as you call it, innovative but not clunky, Robert calls it. But before we do that, just to provide a little bit more context for our discussion, Christoph, the AI for People Scientific Committee that you and Robert are both members of developed some key principles to underpin the use of AI. Can you just give me a sense really of what your work did? I know you also looked at the principles developed by everybody else and tried to come up with a coherent whole, and you identified key actions. But what were the basic principles, and how are you building on that work now?
So actually, I mean, there were a number of other principles developed, but we were the ones who provided it first for example, the high-level expert group. So we had them before them. They have the same 5 principles. So these 5 principles, 4 of them are relatively general. That is, beneficence, do good, non-maleficence, do no harm, whatever that means. Then we have autonomy, justice, and finally explicability. Maybe just to pick one, because that is one where many worries come from. That's the area of justice. So, and especially in the US, there's a lot of worry about AIs discriminating against, and systematically discriminating against, certain parts of the population, whether in terms of, well, as you know, the usual criteria. And there is a worry that this might be increased by AI. However, I would also here again find a word of caution. We also might, on the other hand, see advantages, ethical advantages by AI, because it might also reduce the human factor, which is very often quite biased itself. So it might make some decisions more objective, basing them on a larger information base. So that's maybe just to pick one of the principles.
Thank you very much. And Elizabeth, from your point of view, those principles, the right ones, anything you would add, and which would you highlight? Kilian, they're really highlighting this justice question because it does link very much to the public attitudes perception. What for you are the most important parts of this? And is anything missing from that?
Yeah, well, indeed. I mean, I'm just picking up on what the previous speakers have said. I mean, as well as AI risking creating or emphasizing, shall we say, bias, because it's not creating it, it's what's already in the system, can do it the other way around as well. So, for example, just 2 examples. In the legal sector, we have been helping, for example, with training judges by showing them court cases where the inputs are almost identical, but the outcomes are very different because of judges' bias. So we've been using the training to show them, to make them aware. So that's how AI can actually help the real world, if you like. The same we've had in Elsevier, in the research area, where actually peer review itself can be biased. And so we've been helping by using, we've been addressing that problem by engaging with AI to help, to help show where the pitfalls can be. And I would just like to pick up something that I think one of my panelists said, which was, about ethics and trust. I think a company's permission to operate is based on the trust that society gives it. And therefore ethics, whether it's in AI or anything else, but we're talking specifically about AI here, ethics has to be hardwired into everything that we do, because otherwise we lose the trust. So it is absolutely a business requirement, not ethics in itself, but ethics because ethics helps trust. And without trust, companies cannot operate.
Thank you very much. And Robert, just to complete the picture and bring us back to this broader context we were talking about the presidency and the emphasis, Europe is in the middle of a debate on how to implement its Green Deal, make this a green recovery. That is the thrust of the EU's recovery plan, but it's green and digital. They put these things very much together. For you, as we continue this discussion about the ethical questions that are raised and so on about AI, how do you see that in the wider context of this debate on a greener Europe, a digital and green Europe?
So since I did the innovation strategy review for President Juncker in 2016, I have always been worried that we create principle-driven legal requirements more easily than we do create an ongoing monitoring framework for the emergence of issues around innovative technology. The risk is that paper and law is a very flexible machine. You can say zero without defining zero, or you can ban a product without defining what the product is. And I fear that these approaches inhibit Europe winning in innovation, and specifically in a recovery piece, we face that challenge. And I think at the moment, both on technology, both on digital and on green, there are some risks that we do the stuff that's easy and as a result make it impossible to be the lead innovator that we could be. So I carry into my current private sector profession that worry. And I'm not putting it more strongly than that. I think that Kilian and his colleagues in the Commission recognize the risk. So it's partly technique. How do you regulate to keep us safe but allow innovation? And it's partly politics, because it's easy to say we will ban, but it's not easy to see what comes next. And so that's why I think the more detail we can get, the sectoral approach, the emergent regulatory approach, the more likely we are to be thought leading for the world in terms of being the safest and most ethical, but still a very pro innovation regulatory jurisdiction.
Thank you. And Kilian, can you reassure Robert here? He says he thinks that's where you're pointing. You talked about intelligent regulation, and as the Commission debates and develops its proposals for the new year, do you expect the broad approach? I think I take it from what you said, it will be fairly light touch. It will be designed to make sure the innovation can flourish. But is there a countervailing pressure, as Robert suggests there might be, to say, okay, let's be much more prescriptive in our regulation. Let's ban certain things because that's easier to do than take the more nuanced, light touch approach. Where is that debate, not just within the Commission, but across the EU? How do you see it? Same question to you all.
Thanks for the question. I think what is really appropriate and needed is a risk-based approach. So where we identify first which level of risk are we dealing with, and is there a real problem? So we should not regulate because we anticipate a problem or because we think there may be a problem somewhere in the future, but we should regulate where we identify with use cases that there are problems. And our regulation, whether it be heavy or light, basically should depend on the level of risk, on the severity of the potential harm and the risk which a certain application can cause. And that's why there is not a straightforward answer. I mean, the German Data Ethics Commission has developed this pyramid, which is very sophisticated, so but very elegant, and of course replies very well to different concerns. But there is, and our high-level expert group as well suggested a risk-based approach, and that's really what we need to do is to identify which kind of risk are we dealing with, and do we have then for each level or each kind of risk an appropriate tool, not forgetting that a lot of elements and applications do not carry any risk, because I want to be clear, if you have a predictive maintenance of machines, if you have machine-to-machine communication, there is probably no risk. The risk may start when you have a human interaction, when you have systems which deal with humans, but they can be very simple. It can be a chatbot, and then it might just be enough that you know that you're dealing with a chatbot. But of course, if you go as far as that you have deep fakes, which you cannot distinguish anymore from with a normal eye from a real photo or real film, which can really drive public debates in a very strange way, or where you have, for instance, in recruitment, where you are systematically excluded because there's a risk of discrimination, then of course it gets more severe because the impact on human life and human beings is completely different. So I think there is not one fix-touch-all solution. It must be appropriate to the level of risk. And what is very important is that we need a legal system which is dynamic, because the technology is developing. Nobody knows and should have the arrogance to know what will be the state of the art in 4 or 5 years. Our processes are, by all means and by all efforts, not so quick, because we have a parliament, we need to agree, we need member states need to implement these things. So there's a time decalage between what we are deciding and what will happen on the ground, and we need to have a legal system which is able to breathe and can take up new developments, new technologies, new challenges. So we should have, I think, a system in place which allows us a frame to react quickly when we identify a problem, but we should not try to solve all problems which we just anticipate now. That, I think, would then be, to answer your question, be too heavy.
And a sector-by-sector approach, literally take it, drill down, look at that risk sector by sector, and then decide what needs to be done?
I mean, you focus now on the sector. I think I would focus on the use case or the application, because you can have certain systems in different sectors. I mean, sometimes a sectorial approach makes sense if you use AI in judiciary, but there, I mean, we had this question. We had in the white books this idea of sector and use, and we got a lot of criticism in the public consultation, because people, of course, mentioned that even if you're in a given sector like the health sector, there may be completely innocent applications. If this is just for a commodity steering of your hospital room, why shall this be considered high risk just because it's somehow related to health? Whereas in other sectors, which are usually considering low risks, there might nevertheless be very specific applications which pose a certain risk. So I think that we need to think about I have not the final answer, or I cannot disclose it today, but we need to think about what is a good proxy to really identify and filter out the cases where we really want to regulate and to look at.
Christoph, your response on that, how do we apply that filter to see where we really need to look? And Kilian mentioned their health, and I'm thinking here about, when we talk about how we approach machines with self-learning capabilities, do they get used in clinical practice? Do they not? Health raises particular issues. Is that why you have been going through sector by sector? And how do you respond to Kilian saying he's not sure that's necessarily the right way forward?
I think I agree very much with him on this issue, because it's I mean, we started out around 2 years ago in Europe and elsewhere by saying we want to regulate AI, we want to find ethical principles for AI. That was the very general approach. So now we are down to sectors, but we need to be more specific even. Here at my institute, the IAI in Munich, we are actually working on these questions on that detailed level, because we can have as many principles we want, but what we need to find is ways of implementing them with the people who are actually developing them. So here at my institute, we are always working in tandem. We have the people from the technology side working together with the people with the humanities or social sciences background, and we are collaborating with a number of companies and civil society organizations on these issues. I think that's where we need to go now to get more to the more detailed level, because they want, the developers and the companies, they want this input, because as was said before, AI needs to be trustworthy in order to be used. I like to always say AI will not fly without ethics. And I think that's the core of it.
Thank you. Robert, you called for this sector by sector approach. Your reaction to Kilian's response?
No, I agree entirely. I think use cases is a good way forward. The sectoral approach was the chosen analytical step that the AI for People group took forward. And it worked because bankers know their bankers. They don't necessarily know about AI. I think that what we'll see in December from this sort of, in a way, private and academic endeavor is the opportunity to join the dots horizontally, as Kilian is saying, and to see whether across the sectoral experiences there are common use cases. So I think what both approaches speak to is a certain pragmatic flexibility. And I liked very much Kilian's phrase about a legal system that breathes and that allows flexibility. So I think we're on the same wavelength.
Thank you. Elizabeth, your reaction to this and a legal system that breathes and what that might look like. And don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box or you can raise your hand. But Elizabeth.
Actually, I also agree with Kilian's approach as well. I think that makes a lot of sense. Maybe 2 points to make. The first point is, I think it also requires looking at existing legislation and seeing where that may actually hamper developments of AI. So, for example, I think GDPR needs a tweak so that we are able to be able to test our systems for bias already now, which we can't actually easily do because of the GDPR rules. So I think we need to look at tweaks. I'm not saying wholehearted overhaul, God forbid, but tweaks to allow us, for example, to do that training for bias. The second thing is, I think there's another piece of the puzzle, and I mentioned hardwiring ethics into companies. I think part of this is also incumbent upon the ecosystem looking at how do we educate and train people in organizations to understand the issues and the power that they have from the get-go. So, for example, teaching and explaining not just to technologists but strategy teams, sales teams, the importance of ethics, and how do you train data scientists on this side? So, if you think of a doctor, ethics for a doctor is really part and parcel of their education. If you search ethics in doctors, you get millions of trainings and God knows what. Doctors can be struck off for breaches of ethics. So what read across can we make for technologists? Do we need some sort of structure for that? So I think that's another question that we ought to be looking at.
Thank you, Kilian. Just on this question of the legal framework, there is a lot of debate about the extent to which we need new legislation in this area. Elizabeth's questioning there whether some existing legislation addresses these issues, but also many people and the Commission itself pointing to many areas of legislation that touch on these issues, that can be used to address some of these issues. To what extent do you believe we actually need new legislation? Are there some very specific gaps you want to see filled? I'm thinking particularly perhaps in relation to civil liability and so on, but that we don't necessarily need to take a wholesale new approach. Again, how do you see that balance in terms of the legal framework?
Well, that's a very fair question, because in general we don't regulate technologies, and this is rather unique, but it's not the rule, let's say, that we do this. And we need a good justification for this. And of course, you can discuss under legal scholars quite intensively whether it would now be better to go sector by sector. And I would not exclude that, for instance, for sectors which follow the so-called old approach, so where all the product specifications are in the sectorial legislation, you will probably need as well to amend sectors. So I'm not sure that, not to give a false impression that we with one act can solve all the problems. The starting point for us, I think, should be, or the question we need to ask ourselves is, does AI represent specificities which should be dealt with in a horizontal act? Because notwithstanding the area or the use where this AI is afterwards deployed, it leads to specific questions which should be answered in a uniform way. Then it makes sense to give this uniform horizontal answer, which should then be translated in one way or another in the different techniques in sectorial legislations. If, on the other hand, you believe that the risks are so different in the different areas, then it makes, of course, no sense to have this uniform horizontal legal act. So far, our thinking is, what I tried to explain in the beginning, that AI has some features which are distinct from other technologies, which justify that we solve certain specific items for AI, like the data quality, which we should solve for, because then it doesn't matter in which area the AI is used. There's this problem will in one shape or another always occur, and we need to find a common standard. And that's why we think a horizontal legislation could make sense. This being said, of course, there is always the complexity that we have. This legislation has to interact perfectly well with the legislation which is already in place. Therefore, we need to see, and that is an, I don't want to bore you now with details, but we need to see where we can basically set principles which then need to be translated in sectorial legislation, or where we can directly act. That depends a bit on the sectorial legislation. And of course, we need as well to leave a bit of room to adapt things for specific needs. That's why we, for instance, think a lot about technical standards, which could allow us then for different uses to really break down the requirements, for instance, into technical standards, which can then be adapted to the individual use cases. So it's complex, but we think that the reasoning for horizontal legislation lies in the fact that there is this unique nature which justifies a uniform treatment.
Okay. Christoph, does that reasoning make sense to you? And then Robert.
Yeah, maybe just a brief comment on that, because I think there is one specific area where we really need regulation, where companies have been calling for regulation for years, and that's the area of autonomous driving. I was part of the German ethics committee for autonomous driving. We came up with ethical guidelines for the sector in 2017, but we have not yet managed to achieve a kind of meaningful regulation which will allow us to deploy these cars on the streets. And I think this is what we urgently need. I hope the German presidency will keep working on that.
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, so I wanted to make 2 points. The first is to underline, Jackie, the importance of what you referred to, which is liability. And it's almost a question to Kilian. The Commission has convened extraordinarily good expert groups that have done really first-rate reporting on how liability can be tweaked to be, in a way, innovation-friendly in a space such as AI. And I'm just wondering whether that's being taken forward as part of the package. And the other comment, it picks up on one of the Q&As, which is there from Ode Darwich in CERN, saying, if we're where we are now after 20 years of AI, how do we ensure that we're better placed when in 5 years' time we're ready on quantum? Yeah. I think that's a really important question. And I think this commission, the von der Leyen mandate, could be the moment when we don't just catch up on AI, but we get ahead on quantum in terms of framing this sort of regulatory and cultural framework for new innovation where Europe will be a leader. But I think the liability piece is really here and now, and it could be a big part of the answer for the general public.
Kilian, I'll give you a chance to respond in a minute. I just want to bring Elizabeth in on this area. Your reactions to what you've heard, and particularly Kilian's approach and the way he's outlined it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the liability point is important, of course. And that goes hand in hand with insurance. So you've got to work out the liability and figure out how the insurance works as well. So I think that's, that would make sense for me. But yeah, not much more to add. I think I agree, which is you
started by disagreeing with them, so it's good to have a bit of harmony returning.
I did.
Your reaction broadly to the comments others made, but also specifically on this question of liability. Do we need to have some, when I asked about where we might need specific legislation, where we might need to fill gaps, do you think there is a gap in relation to civil liability that we need to address in a horizontal way?
Yeah, indeed, because, when we had presented the white paper on the 19th of February, we had as well a chapter on liability. And this is, for me, the other side of the coin, because we deal with safety and fundamental rights, which is basically the preventive approach. We try to avoid harm. We try to avoid miseries happening. But the retrospective perspective is, of course, liability. Because notwithstanding all our efforts, we need as well a liability regime. Because in Europe, we have this dual approach. We have preventive safety instruments and we have liability for rectifying potential harm. For instance, the US have a bit of a different system. They have much more liability. They have very deterrent compensations and very little security standards or safety standards. So I think indeed there is a need to look at our liability rules, and that we do this. This is not DG Connect, but the Commission does this intensively. We need to find the right place, because absolutely it's right, and the example of the autonomous car was mentioned. It is of course more difficult if you have an autonomous car which drives with an AI system to identify who's then really responsible for a certain damage. And there you need, if you want to bring these cars massively to the streets, you need to clarify this. And you need to see, and this is important for the user, but it is very important for, of course, for the insurers, because the insurers will only cover risks which they can estimate and calculate. So you need to understand, and in particular, if the systems develop further, so for the time being, we understand that the AI systems used in sensitive devices are basically, they collect data, but every update is basically checked, it's not automatic. So at least there, the software developers still have a means to check what's going on. But in the medium to long-term future, there might even be really self-learning devices in risk-critical functions. Then, of course, it gets even more complex, because then the user may as well, with his training or her training, spoil a little bit the system, so to say, because it forces it to use it in a way which is not perhaps ideal. So far, that doesn't really happen, because these systems are then checked. But there's a number of items, and of course, this needs to be reflected in our idea of causality, of harm, as well of product. What is the product? Because this difference between product and service is going to disappear. So there's a number of items I think we need to work on, and the Commission is very conscious about this.
Okay, take a couple of questions in the audience, and then I want to come back to one of the key points that Christoph emphasized at the beginning when he talked about justice, and this whole question of the public's ability to understand, the public's ability to challenge if they feel there is some bias, to get redress if there is, those sorts of questions. But let's take a couple of audience questions first. Are COVID tracing apps a good example of addressing ethical considerations? Katarina Ossenberg says, I have friends who would never download the Belgian app because they don't trust the authorities. Can we learn something? Let me broaden that a little bit. COVID more generally and the pandemic, and what we might learn from that about some of the challenges we face in this area, or indeed some of the ways to solve it. Can anybody react to that point? Who can come in on that? Christoph, please.
I can do that. Since shortly after the crisis started, we founded the Global AI Ethics Consortium, which is a network of institutions as well as companies and other civil society organizations around the world for addressing the question of responsible AI in the fight against pandemics. Now, in particular, COVID, but we might have others. So I think we will certainly, it would actually not be a good idea not to learn from this experience. Both in terms of the Corona app as well as other issues, we have set up a number of projects in this area now, but we have also done a research brief on Corona apps. So it is a bit too early, I think, at the moment to say exactly what we will learn from the Corona app experience, but we will. We have already come some way here, and it is clear that we need the trust of people to, otherwise those systems will not be used. That we see in the Corona app, definitely.
Elizabeth.
Yes, if I may come in, I think that's a great question because it goes to the very first point I made. The question is, we wouldn't download the app because we don't trust the authorities. So it's not actually about the AI, it's who is using it, right? Again, AI is a bunch of technologies. So how do you build trust in the people, in the organizations that are using it? Right back to the issue of why trust is important, because that gives us to operate whether in the public or in the private sector. On the COVID side, I would just say that can I just add that on the COVID side, I think there's been a huge amount of learning that's being done using AI, I think it's been a hugely positive experience. I mean, when I think about all, for example, the datathons being done on COVID treatments, where people are sharing, companies and organizations are sharing data and, you know, to come up with something, I think there are using AI to really help bring things to the forefront that normally would take years in a matter of months. So I think there's some very positive outcomes that we will see. There will be good use cases.
Thank you. Could I come back on this question, really of really a point that you raised at the beginning, Christoph, and Robert has also talked about, and that's in terms of the public's capacity to challenge things when they think it's going wrong, which links us to transparency issues, to being able to see. We talked about the quality of the data. Elizabeth referred to that at the beginning. What data was used? How can they detect and challenge if they see bias coming in or discrimination and so on? What for you, and perhaps to Robert and Christoph first on this, because I know you've both looked into this a lot. What is the key to getting this part right? Robert first this time.
So one of the ideas that's been around for a while is that you get as an innovator, you can have a faster path to the market if you are more open about the data. Think about Dieselgate. Now, if there had been a more honest and trustable sharing of data in real time, A, the problem wouldn't have arisen, and B, we would have made faster progress towards emission reduction. In AI, you can have the equivalent of pharmacovigilance. You could imagine algovigilance. If the feedback loop is fast enough, you're reducing the risks that many people face a problem because the regulator got it wrong. And then the regulator can watch and react rather than try to guess and anticipate. And I think that's the paradigm shift that the data age offers us. But we have to play with that. That's where the sandpits come in. We have to test whether the feedback loops are quick enough. And in the case of driverless cars, some people fear they would not be. But in terms of a mortgage decision, there is time to avert disaster if the AI threatens to run over my home purchase. So I think that's the sort of approach I would want us to go on exploring. And it's exploring. I think this is where regulators are innovating just as much as AI coders.
Christoph.
Yeah, my comments come in two parts. For one, I would say it should be made clearer from the political side that we also need to have more positive communication about AI, where I see a lot of communication about risks and a lot of focus on risks from many political actors. I think it should be made clearer that there is a lot of ethical advantages to be had. I mean, just think of AVs significantly decreasing the number of accidents and saving a lot of lives. So, and there are many more. So I think from the political side, this should be made clearer. And second, I would say we need more formats to discuss these questions in a collaboration with academia, but civil society, companies, as well as politics. I would, in this context, I would just like to say we are doing that. I would like to invite also the audience to have a look at our website, and we are holding the Responsible AI Forum, which is actually exactly that in November, and it's an open virtual conference with many formats on these topics. So please feel free to register and take part.
Thank you. Christoph, and you talked about more positive communication about AI. There's a question here about, will the German presidency, but I think more generally, will and should the EU put focus on educating society, particularly young kids, teenagers, and raising awareness of these sort of issues? So you might want to pick up on that. But Kilian, just you said at the beginning, public perception matters. It doesn't matter whether they're right or wrong. It's their perception that matters a lot in this area. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of, for me, certainly as a consumer, if I feel I have a course of redress if things go wrong, I am likely to be much more accepting and trusting of any technology. Do you think we're putting enough focus on this and making sure that we have the right mechanisms in place so the public have faith that if they do feel it's gone wrong, they can challenge it?
I think that's a core part of our thinking, because in reality, we do not really want to create new rights. What we want to do is a bit, our point of comparison, if you so wish, is the analog world. We want to have a similar situation, a similar effective enforcement and protection of rights like in the analog world. It should not be because you turn to the new technology or you turn to digital that you lose rights, or you cannot enforce your rights to the extent that you are used to enforce them. I'll give you an example. That it's, if I'm subject to a recruitment process and I'm rejected by an AI device because they check the algorithm checks and I fall out, the scoring system doesn't lead me to a point which allows me to pass on to the next level of this recruitment process, I should have the same redress mechanism than I would have if there's a human being checking this. And that requires that if I have a body, whatever, complaints, ombudsman, whoever, or court, wherever I can take redress according to the different legal orders, that I can reconstruct the decision, or that if I challenge, that the company needs to explain why the decision has been taken in a certain way. And that is exactly where there may be a problem with AI, and that we want to overcome, so that in that case, if everything goes fine, there's no problem. But if something goes wrong and somebody wants to bring a complaint, he or she should have the means to show his case. And therefore, he needs, for instance, documentation, and this decision-making must be made to a certain extent transparent to him or her, so that he can challenge the reasoning. Because otherwise, if you come back to the black box idea, then you would not be able to do it, because the outcome would just be, okay, negative, I cannot do anything, you didn't fit.
Yeah. Elizabeth, a reaction on this, which is a central issue, going back to your point of trust from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I think two things I would say about that. I think we can take a lot from GDPR, where you already have that right? If a decision is taken from an automated, you have the right. You do have the right to challenge that. So it does exist. At least that's for personal information, and of course that would need potentially to be broadened. But I agree with the need to have right of redress. I guess you also need to know when a decision has been taken in an automated way. It's not always obvious. So that I think we need to look at. And I think going back to the question about education and training, I think that's, I think I mentioned that in various parts of this event. I think education and training is hugely important. I think we should not underestimate that importance, because we can put in all the checks and all the balances, excellent redress, ombudsman, the whole lot. We can put it all in, but if the public don't trust, they won't want to use it. So I think it needs to be baked into everything.
Just a quick thought from Robert and Christoph before we come to some final conclusions. But on this question of, Kilian said it should be the same rights as the analog world, not different, not more, not less. Can it be? Or do you think there are, going back to the specificities question, things that are different about the AI world, which mean the rights need to be different? Robert?
No, I'm very clear that the AI world is not a parallel universe. We take our human approach to life in Europe into this new technology. I think that the fear that somehow suddenly rights will disappear or autonomy will disappear is one of the underlying drivers of technophobia. Let me put it like that. But it's not justified.
Christoph?
I agree with that mostly. I think there will probably be some changes in the way we implement those values that we regard as key values for us, and we will need to find a way to come to a rational risk weighing in terms of AI. I mean, also in the other areas, but in AI, we will need to find a way to, and I think this is doable, to reconcile those values that we have with also allowing AI to be deployed and to be innovative and to provide us with the many benefits it has. So that is one of the key challenges, I think.
Thank you very much. We are almost out of time, but I wanted to try, as we await the Commission's proposals and we look at the debate in the Parliament today and the vote that they're having on this, for each of you, of all the issues we've discussed, and I think perhaps, I mean, we're talking here about the German presidency setting an orientation, underlining a way of looking at these issues, but let's be a little bit more broad, perhaps not to the next couple of months, but over the next year or so, if each of you had to identify a key next step, so of all the questions we've discussed over the last hour, for you, the most important or first step we need to take to get the answers to this right, what for each of you would it be? So you can either be where we go from here or one ingredient you want to see in the Commission's plan when it comes out. I'm going to go backwards to the way I started. So Elizabeth, let me ask you first, a key next step or a key ingredient for the Commission's proposals? What do you want to see?
I'm going to put a bit of a spanner in the works, actually. I'm going to say we need to bear in mind that AI is global. We've not used the word global once in this hour, and I think that is crucial. I just want to say very quickly, we did a piece of research. Well, it was done with the Swiss Federal Institute of IP and one of our products, patent site. It looked at patents. Right, I know it's not the only, but it is one indicator of uptake and use of AI. No guessing, no points for guessing that far and away the biggest amount of patents was in the US. US holds 6% of all world-class patents, so I'm just talking about world-class patents. The EU, including the UK, is 8.8. Of the top 50 companies, only 3 are in Europe. And the thing that I found most compelling, US owns 70% of all patents in the UK are invented by British inventors. Yeah. So whatever we do in Europe, we got to take into account the global dimension. It's hugely important.
And this is something, of course, and you're quite right, you talk a lot about the global partnership for AI. I know this is something the Scientific Committee is working on right at the moment in terms of good AI global frameworks. So thank you very much for bringing that in before we finish. Robert, for you, the key priority, key next step or key ingredient you'd like to see in the Commission's proposals?
So it's not so much in the Commission's proposals, but in the German presidency. I would love Angela Merkel to offer to bring to the European level the sort of consistent, sustained conversation around innovation that is a characteristic of the way she's run the Kanzleramt and reaching out to society. I think that whether she personally initiated it or took it on, but we need top-level people to spend time regularly digging deeper into what innovation is about.
Thank you very much. Kilian.
Well, of course, we're looking forward to our discussion to do a proposal, but that you, of course, all know. I would perhaps add then, therefore, beside this, one thought, because what we all learned, in particular, due to the COVID crisis, where we used a lot of AI technology, and sometimes we were even requested to use technology which was not so much tested in Europe, because the first place where data occurred was obviously China. And then the very interesting element for us was to see that there's as well another ethical dimension, because if you don't take up a technology, there is a risk of not taking up, because you can lose opportunities. And if you wait for very long and you do a lot of testing, you might be perfectionist, but you might lose a lot on the way. So I think we need to be balanced. We need, because we spoke a lot about risk today, the risk assessment should as well take into account the risk of not taking up a technology or losing opportunities, not only economic, but as well societal or scientific opportunities, which you have if you do prevent or wait for too long. Even if the autonomous car might not be perfect, it might save lots of lives, even because it might be much better than a human driver. And that I think we should take into account in our assessment. If we only go for complete perfectionism always, and we want to go down to zero risk, we will destroy the technology. So I think we have to have a full assessment of risk.
So
and that's I think where we have to go.
Yeah, to get that balanced framework that we really need to, as you say, seize the opportunities, minimize the risk. Christoph, you have the last word. Your key priority or key thing you hope to see in the new proposals, or indeed before the end of the German presidency?
let me follow up on what Kilian just said. I think it's very important to act now and to get something on the way. Otherwise, we have this risk of losing the opportunity and not using AI. I think this might be a particular challenge for the German presidency, because we have seen that perfection is something that is often associated with some people around here, and I think maybe we should, and that might be a particular challenge, as I said, for the German presidency, to go for a bit less perfection in terms of when it comes to AI and innovation, in order to keep the flame of innovation going. And the last point in this context for me is we also need to keep the young generation on board, and to I mean, it will be them who will be using the technology longer than at least some of us here. And this is also something where we probably need to find some ways of shifting policies, because in the past years we have not always seen such a fortunate policy when it comes to EU and the younger generation and digital technologies. I think this would be a shift that I would like to see from the German presidency.
And on that note, the audience can't join me in thanking you in the time-honored tradition, so I shall do it just all on my own. Thank you so much for a very stimulating, very challenging debate. I'd love to have spent many, many more hours discussing all of these fascinating issues, but we covered a lot of ground in a short time. Thank you very much to Christoph and his team, and to FIPRA for hosting us today. Thank you, Kilian, very much for finding the time. Elizabeth, great to have you with us too. Thank you to all of you for joining. Thank you for your questions and comments. It only remains for me to wish you a pleasant rest of the day and stay safe. Goodbye. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye.